Welcome to Branching Out, a new podcast from Bonsai. I am the co-founder of Bonsai and your host, Matt Butler. Bonsai's platform delivers powerful marketing measurement and custom buying algorithms using first-party data. I aim to deliver interesting, informative insights for the modern marketer and get wisdom from the thought leaders you should know.
Well, thank you so much, Tal, for joining me today. I guess before we get into our chat on AI, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, Tal. I've known you for a long time, but why don't you introduce us to our audience?
Hi, I'm Tal Kedar. I was born in Israel, raised in Israel. I moved to the States when our startup got acquired by Sears Roebuck, of all companies. Spent a few years there. My wife graduated from with an MFA from Chicago School of Art Institute. And so when she graduated, it was like, where do we want to go? And the answer was New York. And we've been in New York ever since. I've done multiple roles in the industry, always around algorithms, AI, inference, those kinds of things. And a few years ago, I started a company, K2DQ. And that's where we are now.
Yeah. And Tal, I've gotten to know you from those Sears days when I got to meet you and learned a lot getting to know you and your work at Sears. And then of course, so much of your work coming after. I feel like now some of those Sears memories are probably fuzzy for both of us at this point. But yeah, it's so excited for you to talk with me today and share some of your knowledge, because I feel like that's what when I think about the times we've talked, I always think about the things I learned when we chat, and because you've got so much great experience and knowledge to share. But you mentioned you started K2DQ a few years ago. Could you tell us just a little bit about what is K2DQ?
So K2DQ aims to bring the power of full-fledged Bayesian inference into marketing optimization. That means being able to calculate how much something is worth so that we don't pay more than we should for it. Prime example being a click on an ad, right? Or a customer acquired, right? So lifetime value calculation, these kinds of things.
Yeah.
There are two fundamental things to understand. One is that a single number is never a good answer when you're looking for actionable answers. Actionable data is never a single number. There's always a probability involved. There's always some kind of a distribution whenever you look into the future. Looking into the past, you can get hardcore single number answers. The average purchase order value, right, in the last 6 months was this many dollars. But when you look into the future, it's always going to be.
I mean, I think that's such a super insight right there, right? Because I think I'll put myself in this category, right? When you think about, when you look at any kind of report of how things have gone, whether it's for your business, for your marketing, for your favorite sports team, right? You're always looking at a report of the past, right? It happened, and so our day-to-day experiences are what? They're looking at reports. There's very discrete answers, right? And I think it, could you talk a little bit about, because you mentioned things like Bayesian inference and probabilities, or I guess how should we think about the idea of living with these certain answers versus how to think about the future?
So data from the past is, given that it was cleaned and it's accurate and that is a whole bag of issues there. But assuming that we have reliable data from the past, that's not actionable because we want to do something in the future. There is some connection between this data in the past and what we expect to see in the future. And that link may be as simple as whatever was yesterday, we're going to see tomorrow, may be very complicated. That link, the best way to describe it is a model, right? That takes as input the historical data, takes as input some assumptions, and outputs a result. And what you find, it's an adage in the industry, right? All models are wrong. Some of them are useful.
Yeah.
A good model is one that gives you actionable insight into the future, and it's always about the future. It's not interesting what the conversion rate was in the past, right? It's interesting what it's going to be, because otherwise it's just vanity. A good model is one that gives you insight that would change your behavior. Meaning, it would somehow affect your decision, maybe as small as what should be the bid on a specific keyword and ad, maybe as big as how much money should we put into advertisement.
Mm-hmm.
A good model will give you the data that would influence your decisions, right?
When you hit on like so many things there, I guess one thing that strikes me is you mentioned, the big questions, small questions, and how to think about the best answer. It strikes me that I think there's this perception that things like models, prediction, AI, which I know we'll talk about, they seem kind of like new things. I guess in the last few years, we've done a lot of, there's been a lot of things that have hit the market, right, that I think make, let's just call it like this kind of stuff more mainstream. But I don't know, I get the sense from you that like prediction and these algorithms and models, these are nothing new, right? I mean, these have been going on for, being used not just in digital marketing, but in a lot of phases for a long time. Can you talk a little bit about sort of like how you think about models, and do you think there's anything new today, or is it kind of the same old stuff with new applications?
Yeah, no, nothing is new except for GPUs, which we'll get to in a second.
Yeah.
But no, these are things, everything I said so far was true since the 70s, right? There was a big change in the last decade, and that was the cost of making a lot of computation became dramatically lower. And so models that even in the early 2000s were just impractical.
Mm-hmm.
Not only practical, but cheap. And a lot of the AI revival is around that. And a big part of that was a technological advancement, which was cheap GPUs, able to do billions and billions of calculations per second at a cost that's affordable even to small regular businesses rather than just government scientific projects.
Yeah.
The other big advances that happen algorithmically is that our understanding of how neural networks behave changed a little bit because of our ability to run these huge, very large experiments training neural nets. And so even though fundamentally the idea of backward propagation and the fundamental of neural nets hasn't changed that much, new architectures, transformers, LSTM, the newer ones, and concepts like chain of thought and the way we treat those networks changed dramatically. And that allows us to put forward new tools. Whether those tools are better or worse for specific problems is a whole different question, right? Yeah. And so coming back to K2DQ, right, we use a very specific framework that does something called Bayesian inference, meaning we start with some belief about the future that's maybe very, very vague, and then we use the data we've collected to update that that belief. And to do that at scale with many hundreds or thousands of parameters requires the kind of technology used in physics simulation, Hamiltonian MCMC or Riemannian MCMC, which won't get into, but that's a technology that also benefited from the recent technological advancement, allowing us to do it cheaply at scale in reasonable time.
Yeah.
But maybe a different tool, something like large language models, might work better for a different kind of problem. Matching the technology to the problem is a huge part of being able to effectively use these new technologies.
There's so many ways I want to double click on that point. I guess maybe the part I'll start with is in your experience, Tal, with K2DQ or prior to that. What are you seeing or have seen from marketers or agencies? What are they getting right about how to capture using these models to good effect? And what do you think that they're getting really wrong?
So I think first, I don't know if it's half, but at least half. I'm not sure. But a lot of marketing teams aren't run neither as a cost center nor a profit center, meaning their KPIs are almost completely detached from the business, right? Mm-hmm. If you start the day by having a budget and your task is to spend it in a reasonable way, and the definition of reasonable is murky or vague, then there's really not that good a problem to solve to begin with. Never mind the tools, right? There's just not a problem to solve.
Let me just I'll clarify in this point just so I feel like I'm understanding what you're saying. But this idea that like if you don't have an objective, like a known objective, like modeling the best way to do something isn't exactly like there might not even be a point, right?
Yeah. Now, moving past that, right? There's a huge difference between growth and sort of more mature companies when it comes to the marketing teams. In the growth phase, many times the KPIs are around either acquiring customers, paying or not, and driving learning, product market fit, and validating a business model.
Yeah.
That means that you either have the KPIs are not bottom line and sometimes not even top line, but rather things like counting number of active users, right? Mm-hmm. Versus with more mature companies, you start more and more seeing the marketing KPIs attached to either top line or bottom line, which allows them, the team, to use data from the rest of the organization to measure themselves, right? And once you do that, that's where modeling comes to play, right? So if we, for example, understand average order values and average margin rates, right? Mm-hmm. We might actually come to a conclusion that some advertising is more profitable than others because even though it drives the same number of sales, it drives more profitable products, right?
Yeah.
And modeling that link between past data and the future allows you to actually come to that insight, right? And saying, okay, if we move $1 from this account to that account, from this keyword to that keyword, whatever it is, right? That's what's going to happen in the top line. That's what's going to happen in the bottom line. And if our KPIs as marketers are attached to those, then this is where we have a problem that a model, some sort, can help us achieve.
I'll pivot back to the main point of our conversation in a second, but I can't resist getting your opinion on one thing I just have to push on. So what, if you had to guess or speculate, why do you think so many marketing organizations are not entrusted with a business metric to optimize to? If you had to like put it, like, is there something that you've seen over the years that leads you to think there's reasons for this? Is it just sort of lack of education, or what do you think it is?
So I think the industry is, as always, right, these things, there's a lag between the business reality and the kind of people you get in key positions, right? Mm-hmm. A modern retailer basically competes on merchandising and marketing, right? For a lot of retailers out there, logistics is already not something they compete on, right? Unless you're very, very big, you're using industry standard third-party providers for your logistics, for a lot of the website, like payment processing, all of those operational aspects. You have to do them well, obviously, but you're not going to create a significant competitive advantage, most likely. Mm-hmm. You're left with merchandising. What kind of products are you offering, and what does it cost you to acquire them? And the marketing side, attracting customers and making sure they know that you have these excellent products at excellent price. Yeah. But I don't think a lot of companies realize that those two are the major competitive advantage, where they can have a major competitive advantage. And so a lot of marketing folks still consider themselves operational rather than creating a competitive advantage for the business, right? Mm-hmm. And that means that they have tasks to do. They think in terms of, we need a campaign, right? We need to execute a campaign. We need to do it well. We need to have really nice, good product images, and we need to, spend wisely. But they don't consider that campaign as creating a competitive advantage, right? So it becomes it's a way of thinking more like operational manager rather than strategic component of the company.
That's something I've seen. I love it. I mean, I definitely I definitely see this in some of my experience. I guess one of the things that I've believed, I guess, and honestly led before Mike and I even started Bonsai, something that had occurred to me or something I felt like was going on is you brought up some good corollaries where, merchandising and kind of operational side of, say, like running a retailer. In that world, right? In in the supply and logistics and manufacturing, like there's standards and procedures, right? I mean, these are maybe solved sciences to some degree, right? And I think in marketing, we've got best practices. And I have to say, like, what's the best practice? Well, best practice is when you don't know how to do it. And if you have best practices, you don't actually have expertise, is my feeling. Because best practices is sort of like, there's something that we don't understand how to do or how it works, but we've done some certain things that haven't screwed something up. So we tell our friends about it. And this is best practice, right? This is sort of like, well, we don't know why it works, but it works.
Yeah.
Right. And if you're doing best practices, they're often long and they're not particularly in any, like, they don't always follow any causal line of thought. They might work to some degree, right? And it feels good. And people think that if we're following best practice in marketing, that's great. And I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just, the feeling that I always have is that like this, like you, like they don't have the best practices of physics. Like they have theory, like there's something to it that quite a bit more substantial. And I think that's one of the things that now I don't think that's because people in marketing or the industry is dumb. I think it's very difficult. This is essentially like business is not necessarily as straightforward as some of the natural sciences or other aspects of work. And so it's not to say anything negative inherently about the industry. It's just to say that I think they're a long way away from having what I would call like standards and procedures that imply a more like, objective driven approach. And I think that's what's probably coming to our industry.
And there's also, I think, a level of a depth of training that's still lacking. So if you think about being an accountant 100 years ago, you needed to have a high school diploma, right? You need to do adding, subtraction, maybe you multiply a little bit. You need to be able to keep the books, right?
Yeah.
You can't imagine a CFO or an accountant today that doesn't have full grasp of the notion of future value of future cash flows and hedging against foreign currency. Like that becomes standard, right? That's a given.
Mm-hmm.
That's the level of understanding. And in marketing, I feel that there isn't that standard level baseline where we start. Or if there is, it's much more on the creative side. It has to do with maybe more historic view of what marketing is. And so many of the managing and many people in key position don't have that kind of background. And so that's obviously harder for them sometimes to adopt tools and strategies that require understanding these kinds of how does auction mechanisms work in the major advertising network, right? What is a lifetime value? How do you calculate? How do you even approach this idea of should we look a year into the future, 3 years, 5 years? When should we do either? And those questions are traditionally weren't part of a marketing training, right?
Mm.
And that obviously you look at people who are now leading marketing teams, you should remember that their training probably happened 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Does the digital marketing industry understand auctions and the power of these exchanges in your opinion? Or I guess what's the first thing that you would address if there were gaps?
I think the platforms are doing a decent job at educating their users, right? But I think there is still it hasn't emerged an understanding of how should a business approach those platforms, right? The relationships between them and how to think about the thing as a CMO. So if you want to understand Google or understand Meta, right, or understand, there's enough material out there, you can get a very good idea of their inner workings, or at least understand the implications on your marketing team. But how should you be using those platforms, right? What is a good goal or a reasonable strategy for a company at the growth stage, at the more mature stage, trying to optimize for this or for that, having this kind of data. I don't think there's a good understanding, common, right, baseline kind of approach out there. And I don't think it's up to the platforms, right? They wouldn't necessarily benefit if people understood what's the best way to use them for, a top line or bottom line linked KPI.
I think it's underestimated how different and how much work there still is to do to help people understand how to benefit from these platforms broadly. And I think a big thing that everything I see out there misses, like, I agree with you that the platforms, I think, do a good job of like building a general sense of like concepts in education. And like there's a sort of as we were talking earlier before we started recording, right, there's a kind of like if this was driving a car, there's like a high school learner's permit level of driving a car that I feel like they've done a great job of solving for. But there are basic things that are very different that I don't think have really been much addressed, right? Like all digital is essentially bought and sold through auctions. And like, there's one thing about an auction is that context matters. And everything that you would do matters. Like, what are those elements of the context tell you how you would use something that is fundamentally different. Like, not the fact that like search ads on digital and the TV ads on a broadcast, like it's sort of important in some respects, but it's actually not the most important difference. The most important difference is that one is not like there's a very direct, much simpler way that attention is exchanged. And there are different questions that you would answer that are simpler. And people still operate in these sort of simple hierarchy of questions of the traditional mindset. And I don't think enough is paid to the idea that like when you layer on the exchange and auction element, that changes. There's a whole other cascade of questions that help you dictate how you should use something like a Facebook or a search or so on.
I'll give you an example. Some of my clients in K2DQ, they don't really care about the values. They only care about the segmentation. Meaning they don't really care how much this group of users is likely to convert or likely to buy, etc., versus another group, right? Or how much should the bid be? They just want the separation, saying these group of people behave differently than those group of people, or using that browser this time of day, from this geography, this kind of purchase history or view history, right? That fundamental idea, as you said, that in an auction setting, there is an infinite number of ways to dissect an audience to create context, right? And we should focus on the context that actually differentiates groups of users or ads or whatever it is from others to and then once you find those different groups, then you can dive in and understand what makes them different, or how much should you be paying to drive marketing to them, or whatever it is, right? But that fundamental idea, I think, yes, a lot of marketing teams don't have the training, the tools, and sometimes also the data to actually do this kind of analysis. And so they generalize, right? They do which is, you do the best you can, but they very often generalize to their detriment, meaning they are making less money than they should.
I guess I sort of enjoyed a bit of perspective as an outsider coming into the industry to see it from, I didn't go to grad school for marketing, right? I didn't come through like some of the more traditional paths through into this side of the business. And so some of it was, I had that like kind of fresh eyes, naivete about it all, right? Learning about how people thought about their 5 Ps and their personas and all this kind of stuff. And, so I could see like some of these things to some degree a little bit clearer, faster, of like, oh, if you didn't have this construct you're trying to see the world through, which in my view is largely down to, in a world without all of these context and signals to consider, like you're largely trying to understand through a cascade of prioritization, like given I have, I can buy one thing or not, and that's all I can do, for whom should I buy it for? And then everyone else is sort of off the table. In digital, like, again, I go back to this, like, doesn't matter if we're talking about search, programmatic, social, or anything online that's exchanged. the real magic is not just finding the one out of the 5 impressions you should show. It's understanding that like I have the chance to show 5 different things. To what degree and amount should I show them all, right, at their relative weight? And that's just not in the vernacular, right, of like the typical like marketing plan of how the kind of legacy approaches that, like how they think about allocating their capital. And it's not because that was necessarily wrong in that time. It just doesn't really apply to how you could do it today.
There are very few CMOs who go to their CFO and say, look, I have an opportunity to spend $1 million and get, this many $5 million to our top line, which translates to $2 million at our bottom line. And I can do that with probability of 90%. Can I have the budget, please? Yeah. Right? And do that routinely on a weekly or monthly basis. Rather, many of them have a budget that's fixed. It has nothing to do with the condition in the market, the opportunities, right? And then they spend it to the best of their abilities, and maybe they shouldn't have, but they would anyway, right? Yeah. That's their budget, and that's just the way. But those kinds of modes of operation between CMO and CFO, right? That's at least for K2DQ, and I think also for Bonsai. You don't want to educate the market, right? It's very, very hard to tell a company that their approach to marketing is maybe not as good as it could be. If it's ingrained in the culture, if that's the relationship between the marketing and finance, the rest of the business, if that's what the CEO expects of the CMO, coming in and saying we think you should be doing it differently is difficult. I
totally agree. Well, I guess to maybe push on that though, I guess what, if anything, in your experience at K2DQ or prior places you've been, of the times you've seen some like material improvement between how the finance, like CFO office and the CMO office is engaged, what are there some good examples of things you have seen that have, you think, moved the conversation forward?
Absolutely. And I always joke, SAP is a company that doesn't sell software, right? It sells a way for the CEO to force their methodology on the organization. Yeah. So as the vast majority of cases where I've seen huge improvement is where we could get either the CEO or the CMO, CFO together to agree that this is the right thing for the company. Obviously, many times it wasn't because of something I said, but rather they felt the need, and then they were looking for tools and solutions outside. But I'll give you an example from Sears, right? One of the fascinating things about working with Sears is that it has such a huge assortment, right? And also, back in the day, right, it touched so many households in the US. Yeah. It would make sense to sell a loss leader back to school backpack at a huge discount, just for the change, for the delta in probability of selling a lawnmower a year down the road with a warranty that has like 99.9% profitability. Yeah. But those two products belong to very different business units, right? Different marketing budgets, getting those people in the room and understanding that it might actually make sense for hardlines to subsidize softline customer acquisition, right? Because from the company's perspective, it's incredibly beneficial. Mm-hmm. I think that was a very good example of a positive change that we were able to make at the time. And it was fascinating to see the politics involved, to understand how do you structure those presentations, again, sometimes company culture, and how to get the allies, internal champions for this kind of a change. But it was, other than the statistical challenge, right, actually calculating how much would acquiring a customer, softline customer, influence hardline sales, right? The political challenge and the organizational change challenge were, I think, I want to say it was 90% to 10%.
If you, speaking of that, the political challenge of some of those conversations, if there's anything that you now know coming out of that you could have told your younger self back then, what would be something you would have told yourself?
So I was dumb. I was young. I grew up in Israeli startups, which are 20, 30 people, fairly good. And Israeli culture, meaning everybody has an opinion, and you can absolutely go to your CEO and say, I think this is dumb, we should do something else, right? That's just the culture. And I naively tried to apply the same approach in a big, fairly traditional organization. And so I would absolutely tell myself, first, get to know the people, understand motivations, incentives, understand the politics when you're trying to drive change. I was completely blind to that. I didn't see that. It took me, I think, 5 years to realize how much of an idiot I was at the beginning. I was asking people to do things against their best interest.
I don't think you were in any way that different than a lot of us, though, right? Like, I think there's a lot of people who kind of, this hits them after the fact, like, oh my gosh, this is a lot more than my idea, right?
Yeah. But you live, you learn. And then another thing is this idea of baby steps, which, as personally, I always dislike this. Like, I want to do the best, most advanced thing right now. But over the years, I realized that doing the smaller stuff first and doing things incrementally dramatically improves the probability of actually getting there, right? And it's better to drive consistent, slow progress than to do a Hail Mary, all or nothing, right? Either we get to the end of the line or we completely fail. The first option is almost always much, much better.
Growing a business is super hard, right? And I think something that I learned myself over time, to your point about those iterative baby steps, which I really, really like now. But like back then, I what I didn't appreciate, I think, was how, you don't really realize it. Like, you might, I worked at Google for a long time, or, but I, worked as, obviously, like at Bonsai as a consultant in many capacities. And, you're engaging and trying to help in, some period of time, and you get to know the business and the teams, and you put in all that work, right? The thing that's tough for anyone to communicate, and for, like, in my view, one of the things that makes the baby stuff so important is that you really can't underestimate how many situations people are in where they've been either doing something for a long time the same way, or maybe even more than that, they've just been in a situation where they've unfortunately been exposed to an environment where no real measurable wins have happened for a long time, like a lot longer than you might.
Yeah.
And they're like you mentioned your point about like activity and other elements of, I guess we're talking about marketing, but we could talk about really many parts of it, any part of a kind of growth part of a business organization. People have been doing things for multiple years, sometimes decades, and it really hasn't moved the needle, and it hasn't really maybe gone down, off the rails, but that creates a situation where people expect the next idea to not work, right? Because the last X number of things and many smart people have come and gone, and like these things haven't necessarily affected that much change. So you never underestimate, like, a lot of times you're up against not just the politics and the dynamics, but just people have lived through a lot of stuff not working. And you to get people excited about something, they need to, we're all like that, right? You got to see a little bit of green shoot from time to time. And so when you have those chances to, even if it's not that material of a win, if you can just generate anything to get people like, hey, look, we did a little thing here. Isn't that cool? Like, to be happy about a little thing like that, that does an amazing amount of getting them like excited to talk to you the next time, or adopt a new, you're trying to push the new, optimizer down there, their boss's, rubric, or you're trying to get this, system turned on, or this campaign activated, or this strategy. And it's like, all those things feel pretty daunting when you've been doing that kind of stuff and seeing no progress. But it's a lot easier if you've gotten a little bit of a win in some small area that you can be like, okay, we actually feel like we can have an effect. That's not, I didn't appreciate till years later about how many situations were, at least inside of them, they feel very intractable, and helping people break out of that, I think, is really critical.
Yeah. So as younger me was completely oblivious to these aspects of actually getting things done.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, I had not one, not two, I had multiple bosses who told me that. and I just couldn't understand it. I wasn't there, right? Like they tried to explain it to me, and I didn't hear it, right? I didn't understand.
It's all good. We've definitely been on both sides of it, I know. Let me pivot us a little bit to some stuff maybe zoomed out from the world of KDVQ, maybe zoomed out of the world from Bonsai for a second. I don't know if you fully went through your full resume, but you're not just a seasoned practitioner and an entrepreneur, and but you're an academic, and you're a lecturer. You're a really a thought leader in the field of prediction, algorithms, AI, etc. I guess could you we're living through the world, the current state of, you mentioned GPUs, and like we're in the middle of the generative AI kind of arms race. We are in the middle of AI being slapped on the end of everything, and there being a legitimate, I think, peak excitement, peak hype, peak something, right, cycle that we're in right now. Share with us, if you could, a couple of things, like how do you perceive, like when you see the state of the industry and like what hits the common sort of like, let's call it like tech discourse or news cycle, from your perspective, how are you perceiving all of this? Like when, like how are you thinking about these changes from someone who's kind of knows a lot more than most of us do about this space? And is there anything you would advise us as we are living through the same cycle that we should like think about as this is all going on?
Yeah. So first, I love it, right? It's all good. It's great. I love that people are interested in something that only 15 years ago was thought completely impossible, and we had the notion of AI 20 years ago, but it wasn't getting a lot of attention on the business side, and so that's great. But I do think there's a little bit of a premature. We picked too early, meaning, from my perspective, the tools are still at the infrastructure level, meaning we don't really have solutions for most of the business problems out there that are directly and easily constructed from whatever you can actually go and get off the shelf.
Mm-hmm.
If you take any of the big LLM models and you do a series of tweaks on it, right, that are the common practice over the last couple of years, you're not getting at the end of that effort something that is directly and immediately applicable to most business problems, right? Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the practitioners on the sort of client side, the people who try to put that technology to use, they sometimes assume that it's already there. So that example you mentioned, right? They think it's a modern car. So you can drive a modern car without knowing anything about internal combustion engine or about an electric engine or about gears and all that. And you're going to be a perfect, fine driver, right? But that's not the same as being a Formula One driver or a Formula One mechanic. And it's not the same as being a truck driver who needs to know a little bit more about the machine. And it's just that the technology is not there yet, right? It's more like we have the building blocks and the blueprints for something that could be useful. Now, obviously, this is where most AI startups, promising startups that I see around, that's where they focus, right? That's where the successful ones are going to be, where they take this basic fundamental technology and then wrap and augment it with whatever is required to solve a concrete business problem and then put it out as a product. But I don't feel like we have a lot of those around yet that's been successful and proven.
Do you think the direction, like what's the first phase of something that's more broadly, let's call it polished and finished? Is it going to be AGI like we hear about, or is it going to be something else?
No, I think on the contrary. So there's this company just announced called Double AI, doubleai.com. Double is the word, DOUBLE, AI.com. And they stress this difference between general intelligence and expert intelligence, right? That this using those large models and their ability to reason, but structuring it in a way that more closely resembles a human expert, which then allows you maybe to solve a particular problem. And it's a very interesting company just put a paper out, which I highly recommend. It's easy to read. And it ties in the notion of probably approximately correct, which again is an idea from many, many years ago. It's nothing new.
Yeah.
But it has this idea that what we're looking for is something that with a high probability gives us results that are close to whatever we're looking for, right? That's the probably approximately correct, the two things. High probability of getting something close to what we need. And that's not general intelligence. And then on a more philosophical level, if I ever go back to do my PhD in philosophy, it's probably going to be on that thing, right? Our ability to, as humans, to do narrativization, to create a story. It's not just about causality, cause and effect, and temporal relations, but this ability to construct a narrative. We don't really have a way to formally define it.
Mm-hmm.
We can't actually create a logical test of what is a good narrative. And it's very hard to build a machine that does something that you can't define.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit skeptical about the whole notion of we can build something that behaves like humans in a wide spectrum of scenarios. And if you want, you can call it general intelligence, but that's a behaviorist look at it, right? It's I'm not sure it would, for me, it actually counts as general intelligence.
I think it on the general intelligence side, my other question is sort of, I guess, not that I don't think what we're seeing these days is not impressive, because it absolutely is. It's more, I do think that we very quickly underestimate people. I'm not sure, even the way, I know and I am not an expert in essentially the benchmarking, the sort of quality and success of current models and future models. So far be it for me to know what's the best. And I'm not weighing in on whether or not the way they test models today is good or not. I'm just saying that I think that let's just hypothetically say we get in the very near term a model that generally does outperform across a bunch of these benchmarks to the level that even experts would say that it's okay, that might be a genius. I think about it's okay, so we've got all of these GPUs, all of this investment, how many millions and billions of dollars sunk into all of this so far, and at the best case we might beat one person, right? As a, you know what I mean? So this collective intelligence, even the benchmark itself is versus okay, are we smarter than all person? What about the fact that any two people are probably way smarter than any one person? And then not to mention the fact that we have all this other, so I think it's a little bit, I'm not sure what to make of the premise of what we're defining as generally intelligent, I guess, because I think there's a lot more to intelligence than just whether or not we, how fast we learn something and if we are good at, a broad set of skills. I think that's part of what makes it intelligence. I don't think that's really that much of it, though.
And we have machines that are much better than humans going back thousands of years, right?
Yeah.
So some of them, right?
Yeah.
My blender is much better than I can manually do it, right? And so, and computers that play chess better than most people that have been around for many, many years. And I would argue that now there are only a few humans who could beat the best chess programs, right? But that's in a very narrow domain, right? And so as we stretch the domains wider, what would constitute general intelligence if it covers all, right? If that thing was better than most humans in most conceivable tasks, right? I think it's a ridiculous notion, right? And it's not an interesting thing to do. It might be an efficient way to create a system that's good at one thing, right? So creating something that's generic and that's very easily adaptable to a specific task. That might be an efficient way of doing it, right? But it's not the end goal. At the end of the day, we are always going to measure these things against specific tasks. Is this a better diagnostician than that doctor, or an average of other doctors, or the best doctors out there? right? Is that a better driver than that this driver, common driver, the best drivers out there? But I don't know what it means to test a general intelligence.
And I take it back to your future philosophy pursuit as you go get that PhD at some point, right? The whole, how we, I mean, this is oversimplifying it, right? But the telling stories and like kind of, it's one mechanism by which we help each other cooperate, like how do you get people to cooperate? And it's like, we're worried with these AGI, is it gonna become smarter than us? And then it's gonna coordinate and it's gonna take over. It's like, well, how is the AGI gonna cooperate with other intelligence if we're not even really sure how we cooperate, right? Like we can't even describe, we do it, and we really don't have any real credible explanation for how we do it. We've got some general ideas, some best practices, but that's all. We can, so how are we, much less gonna we don't know how we're doing it. How are we gonna code a machine to do it? And then how are the machines gonna learn to do it? I think there's just a lot still to be done.
But as always, there's this complete schism, the distinction between the engineering side of things and the understanding side of things. Like we build bridges using Newtonian physics, right? Even though we know it's wrong, like, it's not right, but it doesn't matter, right? For building bridges and it's perfectly buildings, it's perfectly okay.
It works.
You do need relativity once you start building GPS systems, right? Which is incredible. That it's not a very sophisticated system, but already there, Newtonian mechanics fail to a degree that makes moving to using the more complicated, more closer to the truth, maybe theory worthwhile. And so, again, it is not understanding how we would to measure general intelligence doesn't mean that we shouldn't take one of those models, maybe it is general intelligence, maybe not, and then use it for a concrete task. Right? And I think we'll see a lot of that.
So I'm taking away from this, as always, this is like a very, the second we get to talking, I start thinking to myself, like, I just want to keep talking, but I know you've got a life to get to, so I got to let you go at some point. But I'm taking a few things away. One is if you're working in this space, there's a lot of ground to still break. Two, if we're working with, whether it be our, at K2DQ or at Bonsai or any company in this space, maybe worry a little bit less about breaking, making news or hype, but focus more on practical applications, right? Like, what are some concrete things that could help people solve a problem? Because there's plenty of ground to break there. As you cited some real cool examples, and we'll definitely include those links that you shared in the notes with folks on the podcast. But I think I take that away. I guess, is there anything else that you'd advice for anyone, myself, all of us in this industry? Is there any other bits of advice you'd share in terms of how you think we can have an impact?
I think what Bonsai is doing is amazing, right? The knowledge that you share and the framework, the way of thinking that you share is incredible. I think being exposed to a lot of that, right? So having marketing teams think about what should their goal be? How do they put their position in the organization? What's their KPI, right? Coming to a good understanding of that is the best starting point to improving results. And you do that by getting exposed to a lot of opinions, right? So like I said, I would highly recommend people reading the Bonsai content out there just to see a different way of approaching things, right? Understand. And read others, right? And then come to be able to tell a story. This is what we do in the business. This is how we're linked to the rest of the business. And once you do that, you see the problems, right? The challenges just emerge out of that. You say, okay, so we are mostly contributing to the top line. We want to shift that to the bottom line because that's our story.
Yeah.
So, okay, do we know how to calculate profitability? Do we understand that? How would we go about achieving getting to the data, cleaning it, right, etc. What kind of tool do we need?
Yeah.
And then the baby steps thing comes into play, and maybe you do one thing first, and then the second, and maybe right. But yeah, being exposed and reading a lot of alternatives as to how to go about being a modern marketing team, and then distilling out of that reading something that's applicable to your team, I think is a very, very, very beneficial thing to do.
I think everyone should also read some of the great content you guys have on K2DQ. Sorry, I always stumble over that.
No, yeah,
the you guys go into so much. I wouldn't say even detail, but just like there's this. I think you guys have a really elegant way of explaining how to think about the dynamics and the opportunity to optimize towards those dynamics. And whether or not they're using your tool or really just thinking on their own, though, I mean, I think it's just a really important, to your point about getting a lot of perspectives, and a perspective that I'd encourage everyone to go check out, especially if you are a seasoned practitioner. So please do that. The final thought or final question. So it's 2028, and Tal Kedar is wildly successful. Everything has gone exactly to plan, I guess. What does that look like for you or for K2DQ or anything underneath that?
I have no idea, honestly. I don't know. I feel like there's some of the stuff that we do today with K2DQ is simple, meaning we wouldn't be doing it in a few years. It would be completely standard. Like there'll be a dozen open source tools that do exactly the same thing that you'd get to choose from, right? Right now, I think that's not the case because there aren't enough users, right? This is a little bit advanced, and so there's still an opportunity to pedal in something that in 10 years' time would be completely given and obvious. And I'm looking forward to that, right? To these more advanced challenges. So that's one. And then I don't know. It's I spend most of my times actually coding, right? Writing fairly low-level code in C++ and assembly, and dealing with the mathematical side of things. And I really hope I get to continue doing that for the next 10 years because that's where my heart is. But we'll see, I
have no doubt you will, and the challenges are. I guess I think about what you could achieve in next. I don't know if 10 years is enough time for people to catch up to you. Is just one thing I would say. So it'd be great if what all you've done to this date is largely commoditized and available to all. That would be a great world. I think my sense is that it's something longer than that, but we'll see. But hopefully along the way, I'm sure like you'll have a ton of success helping us all get there, and then taking on those next challenges. I hope we can carve out for you some time to work on all those, so that the kind of, like you said, the basics are maybe not totally solved by then, but at least only part of your day, and it gives you the space to play into the future as well. So yeah, Tal, I don't know. It's always a pleasure to catch up with you. It's thank you for letting me pick your brain for a little bit for our podcast. And yeah, I guess if you want to sign off with anywhere people can find you, that'd be awesome.
Thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure. As always, K2DQ.com. K2 is this mountain. DQ is something fundamental to Hamiltonian mechanics. That's where the name. It's not a good name, but it's the one. Cool. It's the one. It's a 4-letter domain name that we could get, right? So I'm always reachable there. Thank you so much. It's been very interesting. We should continue this some other time.
Yes, I got to come out to Brooklyn soon, or you got to come back home here to Chicago, and to your old stomping grounds.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you, Tal.
Thank you so much.